Good afternoon. My name is Tammy Michaels, and I will be working with my colleague Nellie Nino, and we will work on the 24-25 ESSA budget schedules. So let's begin reviewing the budget schedules. First, we'll review the BS 6001 program budget summary and support. The first step in budgeting grant funds is reviewing part 1 of the budget summary schedule seen at the top of the slide. Part 1 displays your entitlement for each fund source and is a summary of available funding. These amounts are generated based upon how you submitted your ADC, also known as your application designation form. Excuse me. If you did not apply for or are ineligible for funding sources, those columns will be grayed out and you will not be able to enter funds in those areas. If you have selected apply on your own, you will see the district's planning amounts. And if you're a fiscal agent, you'll see the fiscal agent's amounts, plus the amounts for your SSA members that have designated you as their fiscal agent. To view the list of members, there's a box at the top right-hand corner, and you can click on that to see your SSA members that have designated you as a fiscal agent. This list will help fiscal agents identify who has not submitted their ADC. And if your SSA member is not on the list, you'll want to reach out to them to complete their ADC. And because we're a little bit further in the grant period, I'm assuming that most fiscal agents have already completed their ADC, and that allows other SSA members to select to apply for you as a fiscal agent. So that's why it's so crucial for fiscal agents to complete their ADC as soon as possible. And before you begin budgeting funds, please double check that the fund sources applied for in the ADC are displayed. If they're not, please reach out to your negotiator right away to reopen your ADC. This is extremely important. It's very, very difficult to change the funding sources once the grant has been submitted and a no-go is released. So let's move on to the next slide to start budgeting funds in part 2. And then part 2 serves as an overview of how grant funds will be used. In part 2, you'll enter the dollar amount by class object codes for direct program costs and indirect costs. These items must align with the organization's needs, campus improvement plan, or district improvement plan. Additionally, budgeted items must be allowable under the authorizing program statutes, regulations, rules, and guidelines. Funds are completely budgeted when the line total funds available minus total cost equals 0 in part 2. It's the lower blue line there. And a few things to remember when completing part 2 include quote unquote, all expenditures, including amounts budgeted for items not requiring specific approval, must be budgeted within the appropriate class object code in order to be reimbursed by TEA. Means that we have to have items budgeted so you can be refunded. If you reap or transfer funds, the funds will still remain under the original fund source. And I believe Dee went into this discussion very detailed earlier. You will still budget them as you're using them under the program they are being reaped and transferred to, but they'll remain under the original fund source. This is the only time you complete the BS 6001. Once it has been saved and completed with no errors, you will have access to the other supporting schedules. Now let's move to the next slide to give Nellie Nino from the PAC team time to discuss the BS 6001.
Thanks, Tammy. So I just wanted to touch on a couple of items that we ran across this past review season in the post-award compliance unit. One of the first items that I wanted to remind you about is that you want to remember that if you're wanting to budget all of your funds in the class object code 8911, operating transfers out, If you are consolidating administrative funds for Title I Part A, those administrative funds must be budgeted in the class object codes 61 through 6600, separate from 8911. So really all 100% of your funding would not go into 8911 if you are consolidating admin funds, because those admin funds would need to go in those other class object codes. Also, if you are utilizing the class object code 8911, any funds that are reserved on the PS 3101 that Vivian went over in great detail, all of those reservation funds must be budgeted in the appropriate class object codes, also between 61 and 6600, if you are wanting to budget 100% in 8911. So you should be, for 8911, if you have reservations on 3101, you'll want to go ahead and break those out into the class object codes, or if you're consolidating admin. Thanks so much.
All right. Our next schedule we will work on is our payroll cost. The payroll cost support schedule will be pre-populated based upon the program budget summary and support schedule that we just discussed. And then although the organization may not have funds budgeted in the schedule from the program budget summary, it will still need to be opened and saved in order to complete the application. Now let's talk about the BS 6101, payroll costs, parts 1 and 2. Funds budgeted in the 6001 program budget summary and support will populate here in part 1, total payroll cost. And keep in mind that all employee payroll costs require specific approval. And we'll walk through that. Part 2A line 1 is the organization's administrative support staff. Enter the number of positions for each fund source. You must include all part-time and full-time positions to be charged to the grant in the schedule. You'll want to use whole numbers regardless of whether the positions are full-time or part-time. And then you'll want to keep documentation locally regarding time and effort. Parts B and C are check boxes, and you do not have to list the number of positions on this section. Please indicate if the positions are LEA or campus positions. The LEA must determine how to classify positions as professional staff or paraprofessionals. That is defined locally. TEA does not make distinctions because every LEA uniquely codes their personnel and their job descriptions are unique. And then note that payroll costs, part 3, is our most frequently negotiated schedules within ESSA, SPED, and Perkins. So we'll dive deeper into these in the next slide. So now let's look at the payroll cost part 3, and we're just going to discuss lines 1 and 2. Part 3, line 1 is for school-wide personnel, and it applies to payroll costs on a school-wide campus. This checkbox covers all personnel at that school-wide campus. This includes paraprofessionals and professionals or any staff member. You are not required to check these staff under the LEA nor campus positions in part 2, as this box covers them all. Excuse me. Instructions in the upper right-hand corner of the schedule can provide detailed step-by-step guidance if necessary. Then additionally, in part 3, line 2, we have extra duty pay. You'll want to check this box to indicate that some or all of the funds budgeted in payroll will be used for extra duty pay. These include pay beyond normal work hours for professional or support personnel not indicated in part 1. And it's also determined by local policy. On our next slide, we'll discuss payroll cost, part 3, lines 3 and 4. For payroll costs in line 3, substitutes for public and charter school teachers not indicated above. You'll want to check this box to indicate that some or all of the funds budgeted in payroll will be used for substitute pay for positions not indicated in part 2. Substitute pay is not to exceed the amount determined by local district policy. Pay for substitute teachers is allowable only for public school and open enrollment school teachers. Substitute pay for private nonprofit school teachers is unallowable under any circumstance. Allowable examples include the following: replacing grant-funded teachers in the classroom who are absent, allowing teachers to participate in grant-funded professional development activities, and allowing teachers to participate in grant-funded planning activities. Now let's talk about line 4. These are for stipends. You'll want to check this box to indicate that some or all of the funds budgeted in payroll will be used for stipends, and this is again determined by local policy. The final step in this schedule is completing the confirmation of payroll requirements box. You'll want to check this box to confirm compliance and assurance that positions are in alignment with the grant program. Now we'll move on to our next support schedule, which is the BS 6201, Professional and Contracted Services. And next slide, please. Thank you. If funds were budgeted for professional and contracted services in the BS 6001, these funds will automatically populate and align remaining costs that do not require specific approval. This schedule is used to budget professional services, consulting services, and contracted services. Costs that require specific approval must be itemized. To itemize these costs, there are 2 lines in the schedule in which to budget items that require specific approval. The first line that requires specific approval is line 1, rental or lease of buildings or space in buildings or land. If funds are budgeted under rental or lease of buildings or professional and consulting services, any amount that is remaining will automatically populate and remain under remaining costs that do not require specific approval. This does not include short-term rental or meeting space for a conference or a workshop or a training. It does include rent for office space for grant-funded staff member for the full grant period. The second line in which to document costs that require specific approval is in line 2, professional and consulting services. If you're unsure which items require specific approval, please refer to the Budgeting Cost Guidance Handbook on pages 4 and 5. They will outline basic itemized costs there. Next, we'll move on to part 2 in our next slide. And again, these are for remaining costs that do not require specific approval. These costs are listed on page 7 and 8 of the Budgeting Cost Guidance Handbook and should be documented in your local policies and bid processes. If funds were not budgeted throughout this schedule, the BS 6201, you will only need to open and save this schedule. Our next discussion is the 6300 supplies and materials. Because supplies and materials do not require specific approval, there is no schedule designated for it. You only budget costs for supplies and materials in the BS 6001 budget summary. So we'll move on to our next slide to cover our next other class object code, which is the 6401 other operating costs. If funds were budgeted for other operating costs in the 6001, these funds will automatically populate in the line remaining costs that do not require specific approval. We will discuss costs in the next slide, but for now, let's focus on costs that do require specific approval. All activities requested to support the grant program must be allowable under the authorizing program statute, regulations, rules, and be in alignment with the campus improvement plan and district improvement plan. And then this schedule has 2 distinct requirements. Under the activities requiring specific approval, there is 1, costs that require the organization to keep the documentation locally, and 2, costs that require pre-authorization in writing. Let's first talk about the activities that require the organization to keep documentation locally. When budgeting for these activities, please complete the appropriate document under the section Justification of Expenditures through the forms for prior approval, disclosure, and justification, and we have a hyperlink there for it. Remember, you don't have to submit these specific forms to TEA as you had in the past. Instead, you complete the forms and maintain them locally for audit purposes. Let's move to the next slide to discuss the costs that require pre-authorization in writing and budgeting for costs that don't require specific approval. Okay, let's briefly discuss costs that require pre-authorization in writing. When budgeting for these activities, please complete the appropriate documentation under the section prior approval request for participant support costs through the forms for prior approval, disclosure, and justification. Again, the link is provided here. These documents are a little bit different and will be submitted via the Edgar Work App system and must also be maintained locally. The Work App system is a secured, automated online system, and it tracks the submission, review, and approval of forms. Items that require pre-authorization in writing must be approved by the program area to have it charged to the federal grant. Then the final section of the BS 6401 is remaining costs that do not require specific approval. To identify if a cost does not require specific approval, please review pages 13 and 14 of the Budgeting Cost Guidance Handbook. Items frequently budgeted in remaining costs are in-state travel for employees and printing costs. Because there is a line for out-of-state travel in the schedule, applicants who are new at completing these forms expect to find a line for in-state travel. However, there isn't one, as in-state travel does not require specific approval. Please budget these in the remaining 6401. Okay, next slide, please. Next, we're going to discuss debt services. Thank you. Debt services schedule allows organizations to budget for two activities. These are subscription-based information technology arrangements, also known as SPIDAs, and debt services. SPIDAs are for leases with a term greater than 12 months and less than 5 years. A capital lease purchase must cover parts of at least 2 grant periods. We highly recommend reviewing the Universal Errata on SPIDAs released by TEA for further guidance. You may find a link to the Universal Erratas on the Grant Opportunities page. In this slide, we will discuss the BS 6501 Part 1 section regarding SPIDAs. In line 1, you'll enter the amount of the SPIDA being charged to the grant for the grant period only. So for example, this one I believe is July 1st of 24 to September, July, I'm trying to remember the exact date. It is 1 year. In line 2, enter the amount being charged for interest on the SPIDA, again for the grant period only. Now let's move to the next slide. In this slide, we will discuss the BS 6501 Part 1 regarding capital lease liability cost. Capital leases are usually a 2 to 3 year agreement where the purchase could not be completed in a single year, and the contract dates must include this current school year. Costs must align with the grant program, be allowable, and be addressed in the CNA and district assessment. For more guidance on these costs, please review the instructions in the upper right-hand corner of the schedule. Now let's discuss how to complete the capital lease liability cost in Part 1. In line 3, we enter the capital lease principal being charged to the grant for the grant period only. And then in line 4, enter the amount of capital lease interest being charged to the grant for the grant period only. Now let's move to the next slide to discuss Part 2. In Part 2, if there are funds budgeted for SPIDAs, we will budget the entire cost of the SPIDA under description of SPIDA, and we will complete the following. Describe the SPIDA and then state the fund source the item is being budgeted under. Enter the entire subscription cost for the full length of the agreement and document the entire contract period. In Part 3, if funds were budgeted for capital lease liability, we will budget the entire cost in Part 2 under property, and we will complete the following. Describe the property and document the fund source the item is being budgeted under. Enter the entire cost of the property for the full length of the agreement and document the entire contract period. Now let's move on to the next slide to give Nellie Nino time to discuss common findings.
Thanks, Tammy. So a few things that we saw in our reviews this last review season included the amounts entered on this schedule. So as Tammy mentioned, in part one, the amount entered must only be for the current grant period. So if, and then in part two, the entire subscription cost should reflect the entire length of the subscription. So let's say you have a subscription and the subscription cost is $3,000 over 3 years. So you would enter $3,000 on the subscription cost in part two. However, in part one, under whatever title program is funding these debt services, you're going to want to list, say, $1,000 for 1 year of that subscription. So those two amounts, you definitely want to make sure that those two amounts are different. The amount that you put in part one and the subscription cost or property values that you put in part two and part three. Also, this contract start and end dates, they must extend beyond 1 year, like Tammy mentioned. So if the subscription is only for 1 year, the expenditure doesn't belong in the 6501. And the final thing to keep in mind is that items listed obviously must be allowable per the program guidelines, and that's one of the things that we're checking for also. Thank you.
All right, we will now work on our final class object code, which is the BS 6001 capital outlay. In this schedule, we want to first discuss changes being made to EDGAR. EDGAR, as you know, is being updated, and the capital outlay threshold should be changing from $5,000 to $10,000 per item. However, guidance still has not been released. So please budget with a $5,000 capitalization level and stay tuned for updates to EDGAR and these changes being released. Further guidance will be provided. When budgeting, make sure the items that are aligned with your local and federal policies as how you capitalize. For example, EDGAR rules state that a single unit with a cost of $5,000 or more per unit must be capitalized. However, if your LEA has a more restrictive capitalization threshold, then use the rule that is more restrictive. Some districts have a capitalization level of $500. Therefore, you'll want to follow the district's capitalization level of $500 or more per item. Capitalized items should be identified at your local level for the campuses and eligible students and documented in the CNA and DIP. This is a reminder that unusual costs may require pre-authorization in writing. Even if the application is approved and the district has received the NOGA, negotiators will not return the grant to remove the item if it is for unusual costs. It is the organization's responsibility to submit the documentation to request this in a timely manner before you purchase these items. Let's move to the next slide. And if funds were budgeted for capital outlay in the program budget summary and support in the BS 6001, these funds will automatically populate in capital outlay schedule in part 1, line 3, furniture, equipment, vehicles, or software costs for items in part 2. If needed, the organization will need to move funds to itemized cost in lines 1 for library books and media and or into line 2 for additions, improvements, or modifications to capital assets. The funds budgeted into these two lines will automatically be deducted from line 3. And next slide, please. Okay. Now let's discuss furniture, equipment, vehicles, or software, which is the most common form of capitalization. If funds were budgeted for capital outlay and were not used in lines 1 and 2, as we just discussed, you will need to include a generic description of the equipment, the funding source, and the number of units being purchased. Also include a description of how it will be used to accomplish the goals of the program. A common negotiation issue in here is using brand names. Please make sure to use generic descriptions and tie the purpose for purchasing these items into the program guidelines. Next slide, please. Thank you. And then Nellie, I believe this is for you, correct?
Yep.
Thank you.
So just very briefly, just so you know, we're reviewing for allowability based on the program guidelines. So if an item falls under the umbrella of special and/or unusual costs, an approval form must be submitted via forms for prior approval, disclosure, and justification through the Edgar Forms work app, as Tammy, mentioned a few slides back. So if you think that what you're asking for funding for falls under that umbrella of special and/or unusual costs, you'll want to go ahead and complete that form and have it on file.